A young woman inherits a plot of land on the outskirts of a quiet village. She soon discovers it's an abandoned graveyard where the dead never rest. As she begins to unearth the past, she finds herself trapped in a cycle of death and resurrection, with no way out. The letter arrived on a damp, gray morning, sealed in an envelope that looked as old as the hands that must have written it. Elena hadn't expected anything of the sort. After all, who still sent letters these days? She stared at the delicate script spelling out her name and address, feeling a strange chill creep down her spine. The paper was rough to the touch, almost as if it had been buried and exhumed. Inside was a single sheet, yellowed with age, but the ink was fresh and dark. The message was brief and to the point. To Miss Elena Hawthorne, it is with deepest condolences that we inform you of the passing of your grandmother, Mrs. Evelyn Hawthorne. As the sole surviving heir, you are entitled to her remaining estate, which includes a plot of land located in the village of Ravensbrook. Details will follow. It was signed by a solicitor she had never heard of. Elena sat back in her chair, letting the letter slip from her fingers onto the table. She barely remembered her grandmother, an old woman who had seemed more like a figure from a distant past than a real person. The only memories she had were of brief visits as a child, in a house that smelled of mothballs and old wood, where her grandmother had always kept her distance, more a silent observer than a loving relative. She hadn't thought about her in years, yet here was this letter, pulling her back into a family history she had long tried to forget. Ravensbrook. The name tugged at a corner of her memory, but she couldn't place it. With a deep breath, she picked up the letter again, examining it for any more clues. There was nothing, just the bare bones of a message that felt like it carried far more weight than the simple words suggested. A week later, she found herself on a narrow, winding road surrounded by thick woods that seemed to close in tighter the further she drove. The village of Ravensbrook was nowhere to be found on modern maps, but the solicitor's directions had been clear enough. Elena had debated whether to come at all, but something about the whole situation gnawed at her curiosity. It was a decision made half out of duty, half out of a need to escape her mundane life in the city. As her car crawled along the road, the trees gave way to a clearing, and she caught her first glimpse of the village. Ravensbrook appeared almost as an afterthought in the landscape, a cluster of old stone houses with slate roofs that gleamed wetly in the morning mist. There were no signs of life, just the oppressive silence that hung in the air, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Elena parked her car near what seemed to be the village square, a modest open space with a stone well at its center. She stepped out, her shoes sinking slightly into the damp earth, and took in her surroundings. The houses, though quaint, looked weathered and forlorn, as if time had passed them by, leaving them to slowly decay. There were no modern touches, no cars, no signs, nothing to indicate that the village had kept pace with the world outside. She spotted a small, faded sign pointing down a narrow path, with the word Hawthorne etched into the wood. It led away from the square, towards the outskirts of the village. Heart pounding with a mix of trepidation and curiosity, Elena followed it, her footsteps echoing softly in the stillness. The path wound through a dense copse of trees, their branches bare and clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. After a short walk, she emerged into a clearing, and there it was, the plot of land she had inherited. It was a graveyard. Elena stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, staring at the overgrown field of headstones and tangled weeds. The graveyard was ancient. That much was clear. The headstones were worn, their inscriptions eroded by time and weather, leaving most of them unreadable. A few graves were marked only by rough stones or wooden crosses, half buried in the earth. The whole place felt forgotten, abandoned to nature's relentless grip. But as Elena took a hesitant step forward, something caught her eye. In the center of the graveyard, partially obscured by a tangle of brambles, stood a mausoleum. Its stone was dark and weathered, but the door was intact, a heavy iron slab with intricate carvings that had somehow resisted the ravages of time. The air around it was still, unnaturally so, as if the graveyard itself held its breath in its presence. The letter had not mentioned this. It hadn't mentioned anything about a graveyard at all. What kind of inheritance was this? The thought of turning back crossed her mind, of getting in her car and driving away from this eerie place. But something compelled her to stay, to move closer, to uncover what lay hidden in this forgotten corner of the world. Elena approached the mausoleum, her steps slow and deliberate, her eyes locked on the door. As she drew nearer, the details of the carvings became clearer. Twisted shapes that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. Figures that might have been human, but whose faces were distorted into expressions of agony or terror. She reached out, her fingers hovering just above the cold iron, when a sudden gust of wind whipped through the clearing, sending a shiver down her spine. She pulled her hand back, her heart hammering in her chest. What was she doing? This was insane. Yet even as she berated herself, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was meant to be here, that this graveyard held answers to questions she didn't even know she had. For a moment, the wind died down, and the silence returned, heavier than before. Then, faintly, she heard it, a whisper, so soft she thought she might have imagined it. It came from the direction of the graves, a low murmur that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Elena turned, scanning the graveyard with wide eyes. There was no one there, just the graves and the twisted branches of the trees overhead. But the whisper came again, more insistent this time, and she felt a chill run through her as the sound seemed to wrap around her, pulling her deeper into the graveyard. Compelled by a force she couldn't explain, she began to move, walking among the graves, her eyes darting from one headstone to the next. The whispers grew louder, though still too soft to make out any words. They seemed to come from all around her, from the very soil beneath her feet. Her gaze fell on a grave near the edge of the clearing, where the earth looked freshly disturbed. The headstone was newer than the others, though still worn and weathered. She crouched down, brushing away the leaves that had collected at its base, and squinted at the faint inscription. Evelyn Hawthorne. Her breath caught in her throat. This was her grandmother's grave. She hadn't known her well, hadn't been close, but seeing the name etched in stone in this place filled her with a deep sadness. She reached out, tracing the letters with her fingertips, feeling the rough stone under her skin. As she did, the whispers seemed to coalesce, becoming clearer, though still just out of reach. But then, as if the grave itself was responding to her touch, the earth beneath her feet shifted. Elena stumbled back, her heart leaping into her throat as she watched the soil around the grave sink slightly, as though something underneath was moving. She froze, her mind racing. What was happening? Was this some kind of trick, or had she really just seen the earth move on its own? Before she could react further, a shadow fell over her, and she looked up to see a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, watching her. It was an old woman, her face hidden beneath a dark hood, her posture hunched as if weighed down by the years. She said nothing, just stood there, silent and unmoving, her eyes fixed on Elena. The air grew colder, the whispers fading into an eerie stillness. Elena felt rooted to the spot, unable to tear her gaze away from the figure. There was something about her, something that filled Elena with a sense of foreboding. Finally, the woman spoke, her voice a raspy whisper that seemed to carry on the wind. "You should not have come here, child. This place is not meant for the living." Elena's heart pounded in her chest as the old woman's words hung in the air. The atmosphere felt thick, charged with a tension she couldn't quite place. The wind picked up again, rustling the leaves and sending a chill through her bones. She wanted to respond, to ask who this woman was and what she meant, but the words wouldn't come. It was as if the graveyard itself had stolen her voice. The old woman didn't move from her spot at the edge of the clearing. Her presence was unsettling, her face still obscured by the deep hood, casting a shadow over her features. Only her eyes were visible, dark and piercing, holding a depth of knowledge that Elena couldn't begin to fathom. "This place," the woman continued, her voice barely more than a whisper, "it holds more than just the dead. It is a gateway, a prison for souls that cannot find peace. The living have no place here." Elena swallowed hard, finally finding her voice, though it was shaky. "Who are you? How do you know my grandmother?" The woman remained silent for a moment, as if considering whether to answer. Then she stepped forward, moving with a slow, deliberate grace that belied her apparent age. Her hands, wrinkled and gnarled, reached up to pull back the hood, revealing a face that was both familiar and strange. Elena gasped. The woman's face was deeply lined, her skin pale and thin, as if it had been stretched too tightly over her bones. Her eyes, however, were sharp and clear, gleaming with an intensity that didn't match her frail appearance. "I am Marjorie," the woman said, her gaze never leaving Elena's. "I have been the keeper of this place for many years, long before your grandmother came here." Elena frowned, confusion mixing with the unease she felt. "The keeper? What do you mean?" Marjorie sighed, as if the weight of what she was about to say was almost too much to bear. "This graveyard is not what it seems. It was never meant to be a final resting place for the dead. It was a mistake, a consequence of a past that should have remained buried. Your grandmother knew this, but she was drawn here, just as you have been." "A mistake?" Elena echoed, her mind racing to make sense of the woman's words. "What kind of mistake?" Marjorie stepped closer, her gaze softening slightly. "This land is cursed. It was once the site of a terrible ritual, one that tore open a doorway between this world and another. The souls buried here were not meant to rest. They are trapped, caught between life and death, unable to move on, and now they are restless." Elena felt a chill run down her spine. She glanced around the graveyard, her eyes tracing the outlines of the weathered headstones and the mausoleum that loomed ominously in the center. The whispers had faded, but she could still feel their presence, like a cold breath on the back of her neck. "Why would my grandmother come here then?" Elena asked, her voice trembling. "Why would she stay in a place like this?" Marjorie's expression grew even more sorrowful. She was searching for something she lost long ago. But in doing so, she became bound to this place. Her soul, too, is now trapped here, unable to find peace. The weight of Marjorie's words settled heavily on Elena's shoulders. Her grandmother, distant and enigmatic in life, was now a prisoner of this cursed land, in death. The realization filled Elena with a profound sadness, but also with a determination she hadn't expected. "I need to help her," Elena said, her voice stronger now. "I need to free her soul, and the others too." Marjorie shook her head slowly, a look of pity in her eyes. "It is not so simple, child. The curse that binds this place is ancient, its roots buried deep in the earth. To break it would require great sacrifice, and even then, there are no guarantees. Many have tried, and all have failed." Elena felt a surge of defiance rise within her. "I have to try. I can't just leave her here like this. A rush of cold, stale air greeted her, carrying with it the scent of earth and decay. The interior of the mausoleum was pitch black, an abyss that seemed to swallow the light of day. Elena hesitated only for a second before stepping inside, her heart pounding in her ears. The door swung shut behind her with a heavy thud, sealing her inside. Elena stood still, letting her eyes adjust to the darkness. Slowly, shapes began to emerge, a narrow staircase leading down into the earth, walls lined with ancient, crumbling stone, and the faint outline of carvings similar to those on the door, twisted and malevolent. The whispers returned, louder now, echoing off the stone walls, their tone pleading and desperate. They seemed to surround her, filling the space with a sense of overwhelming sorrow and despair. Elena steeled herself and took the first step down the staircase, her hand gripping the cold, rough wall for support. The descent was slow and treacherous, the steps uneven and slick with moisture. The deeper she went, the colder the air became, until her breath fogged in front of her and her skin prickled with goosebumps. At the bottom of the staircase, she found herself in a small, circular chamber. The walls were lined with niches, each holding a stone urn covered in thick layers of dust. In the center of the chamber was a raised dais, upon which sat a large, ornate chest, its surface inlaid with strange symbols that seemed to pulse with a faint, eerie light. Elena approached the chest, her heart pounding in her chest. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening now, as if the very walls were alive with the voices of the dead. She could feel their presence all around her, pressing in on her, suffocating her with their despair. With trembling hands, she reached out and touched the chest. The moment her fingers brushed the surface, the whisper stopped, leaving a heavy silence in their wake. For a moment, Elena was paralyzed by fear, unable to move or breathe. But then, with a surge of determination, she forced herself to open the chest. Inside, she found a small, leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age. The cover was embossed with the same twisted symbols that adorned the chest and the mausoleum door. There was also a small, intricately carved key, made of a metal that gleamed dully in the dim light. Elena picked up the book, her hand shaking as she opened it. The pages were filled with dense, cramped writing, the words unfamiliar and almost impossible to read. But as she flipped through the pages, she began to recognize some of the symbols of protection, of binding, of sacrifice. The last few pages were blank, except for a single line scrawled in a hurried, desperate hand. The door must be sealed. The souls must be freed. Blood must be spilled. Elena's breath caught in her throat. The meaning was clear. The only way to break the curse was to perform the ritual again, to seal the doorway and free the trapped souls. But the price would be steep. A sacrifice of blood, her blood. She clutched the book to her chest, her mind racing. Could she do it? Could she sacrifice herself to save her grandmother? To free the souls trapped in this cursed graveyard? The whispers returned, softer now, almost soothing. They seemed to wrap around her, offering comfort, urging her to continue, to see the task through to the end. Elena looked at the key in her hand, the cold metal pressing into her palm. The choice was hers, but the path was clear. She would do whatever it took to free her grandmother's soul, even if it meant sacrificing her own. Taking a deep breath, she turned and began to climb the staircase, the book and key clutched tightly in her hands. The darkness pressed in around her, but she no longer felt afraid. She had made her decision. She would face whatever lay ahead, and she would break the curse, no matter the cost. Elena emerged from the mausoleum into the gray light of day, her mind still reeling from the weight of the task ahead. The clearing was silent, the oppressive stillness more suffocating than before. The air seemed heavier, as if the very atmosphere was thickening with each passing moment. She clutched the leather-bound book and the key to her chest, feeling their weight as a physical burden. Marjorie was waiting for her at the edge of the clearing, her hood pulled up once more, casting her face in shadow. Her presence, though solemn, provided a small measure of comfort to Elena. She felt less alone, knowing that someone else understood the gravity of the situation. "You have the book," Marjorie said, her voice a low murmur. It wasn't a question. Elena nodded, holding the book out to her. "I found it in the chamber below. It explains the ritual, what needs to be done to break the curse." Marjorie's gaze shifted to the book, but she made no move to take it. "Do you understand what it asks of you?" Elena hesitated, then nodded again. "It says that blood must be spilled, that the door must be sealed to free the souls trapped here." Her voice faltered slightly. I think it means I have to sacrifice myself." Marjorie sighed, a deep, sorrowful sound. "The ritual requires a life, yes, but it does not necessarily have to be yours." Elena blinked in surprise. "What do you mean?" Marjorie's eyes met hers, the sorrow in them deepening. "The curse that binds this place was born of blood, and only blood can end it. But the ritual allows for a choice. The one who performs the ritual can offer their own life, or the life of another." Elena felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. "You mean I have to choose someone else to die?" Marjorie nodded slowly. "Yes, but understand this. The choice is yours alone. You can offer your own life to save the souls trapped here, or you can take another's life to achieve the same end. It is a terrible burden, but it is the only way." Elena's mind reeled at the thought. Could she really condemn someone else to die? The idea was abhorrent, yet the alternative was equally horrifying. The whispers, soft and persistent, brushed against her consciousness, reminding her of the weight of her decision. "Is there no other way?" Elena asked, her voice trembling. "Can't I just seal the door and free the souls without anyone dying?" Marjorie shook her head. "I wish it were so, but the curse is too strong. It feeds on life, on the essence of the living. To break it, that life must be given willingly, whether it is yours or another's." Elena's thoughts raced. She had come here to help her grandmother, to do what was right, but this was more than she had ever imagined. She couldn't picture herself killing someone, not even to end this nightmare. Yet the thought of dying herself, of giving up everything, filled her with fear and sorrow. She wasn't ready to die. Not like this, but the faces of the villagers flashed in her mind, those hollow-eyed people who had seemed strange, out of place. They were a part of this too, bound by the curse. What if one of them was willing to offer their life? What if they had been waiting for someone like her, someone to end their torment? Elena's thoughts turned to Marjorie. The old woman had been the keeper of this place for so long, burdened with the knowledge of the curse and the souls it trapped. Perhaps she would be willing to make the sacrifice. Elena felt a flicker of hope, but it was quickly extinguished by guilt. Could she really ask Marjorie to do that? "No one should have to die for this," Elena whispered, more to herself than to Marjorie. I don't know if I can do this." Marjorie's gaze softened. "The choice is yours, child. But know that whatever you decide, you will not be judged. The burden of this curse has weighed heavily on many before you, and it will continue to do so until it is broken. You have the strength to end it, but the path is not an easy one." Elena looked down at the book in her hands, the pages fluttering slightly in the breeze. The twisted symbols seemed to mock her, daring her to make the impossible choice. She felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, the enormity of the situation crashing down on her. But then, as she stood there, torn between fear and responsibility. She remembered her grandmother, the distant memories of that stern but kind woman who had always seemed to carry the weight of the world on her shoulders. Evelyn Hawthorne had come to this place seeking something, perhaps redemption, perhaps peace. Whatever it was, she had been drawn here, just as Elena had been. And now, Elena was the only one who could finish what her grandmother had started. "I'll do it," Elena said finally, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "I'll perform the ritual, but I need time to think about how." Marjorie nodded, understanding. "Take the time you need, but do not tarry too long. The spirits grow restless, and the longer the curse remains unbroken, the stronger it becomes." Elena turned away, the weight of the book and key heavy in her hands. She made her way back to the village, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. The streets were just as empty and silent as when she had first arrived, the air thick with a sense of foreboding. She walked through the narrow lanes, the buildings leaning in as if to listen to her thoughts. As she reached the village square, Elena paused, her eyes drawn to the stone well at its center. The well was old, its stones weathered and cracked, but there was something about it that seemed to call to her. She approached it slowly, peering over the edge into the darkness below. The whispers returned, faint and distant, as if carried up from the depths of the well. They were different from before, more insistent, almost pleading. Elena felt a chill run down her spine as she stared into the darkness, the shadows shifting and coalescing into shapes she couldn't quite make out. She pulled back, her heart pounding. The well seemed to pulse with a life of its own, as if it were a gateway to something far deeper and darker than she had imagined. She had no doubt that it was connected to the curse, that it held some part of the darkness that had seeped into this place. But what could she do? The ritual required a life, a sacrifice, and Elena was no closer to making that choice. She could feel the weight of the book pressing down on her, the symbols on its pages pulsing with an eerie light, as if mocking her hesitation. "I have to decide," she whispered to herself, though the words felt hollow. The well loomed before her, a reminder of the darkness she was about to face, and she knew that whatever choice she made, it would define the rest of her life. Elena turned away from the well, her thoughts swirling with doubt and fear. She needed time to think, to come to terms with the impossible decision that lay before her. But she knew that time was running out, that the spirits trapped in the graveyard were growing more desperate with each passing moment. With a heavy heart, Elena made her way back to the small inn where she had been staying. The village remained eerily silent as she walked, the shadows lengthening as the day slipped into evening. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that unseen eyes were tracking her every move. As she reached the inn, she paused at the door, her hand on the worn wood. She had come here seeking answers, but all she had found were more questions and the crushing weight of responsibility. The whispers echoed in her mind, a constant reminder of the decision she had to make. Elena pushed open the door and stepped inside, her thoughts heavy as she made her way to her room. The inn was quiet, the other guests, if there were any, remaining unseen. She shut the door behind her, the familiar creak of the floorboards grounding her in the present, but only just. She set the book and key down on the small wooden table by the window and sank into the chair beside it. Outside, the night was falling fast, the sky darkening as clouds gathered overhead. The wind picked up, rattling the shutters and howling through the narrow streets. Elena stared at the book, her mind churning. She knew what had to be done, but the question of how still plagued her. She couldn't bring herself to take another life, but the thought of sacrificing her own filled her with a deep, gnawing fear. What if she failed? What if the curse remained, her sacrifice in vain? She rested her head in her hands, her thoughts spiraling into despair. The silence of the room pressed in around her, amplifying the whispers that had taken up a residence in her mind. Then, as if in response to her turmoil, there was a soft knock at the door. Elena's head shot up, her heart skipping a beat. For a moment, she thought she had imagined it, but then the knock came again. More insistent, she rose from the chair and approached the door, her hand hesitating on the handle. Who could it be at this hour? The innkeeper? Another villager? Or something else entirely? Taking a deep breath, Elena opened the door. Standing on the other side was a young woman, her face pale and drawn, her eyes wide with fear. She was dressed in simple, old-fashioned clothes, her hair pulled back into a loose braid. Her hands trembled as she clasped them in front of her. "Please," the woman said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I need your help." Elena stared at the young woman on her doorstep, her mind racing to catch up with the sudden appearance. The woman looked desperate, her wide eyes filled with a fear that Elena recognized all too well. The whispers in the back of her mind seemed to grow louder, pressing in on her as if urging her to act. "Please," the woman repeated, her voice shaking. "You have to help me. They're coming for me." Elena felt a chill run down her spine. "Who's coming? What's happening?" The woman glanced over her shoulder, as if expecting to see someone, or something, following her. "The villagers," she whispered. They've gone mad. They want to sacrifice me, to end the curse. But I don't want to die. Please, I don't want to die." The words hit Elena like a punch to the gut. The ritual, the sacrifice. It was all coming together in a way that made her stomach churn. The villagers knew about the curse, and they were willing to sacrifice one of their own to break it. But the idea of this young woman being offered up to whatever dark forces ruled this place was unbearable. "Come inside," Elena said quickly, stepping aside to let the woman in. She closed the door behind her and locked it, the sound of the bolt sliding into place strangely satisfying. For a moment, the room felt like a small island of safety in a sea of danger. The woman collapsed into the chair Elena had just vacated, her hands shaking as she clasped them together on her lap. She looked up at Elena with a mixture of gratitude and fear. "Thank you," she whispered. "I didn't know where else to go." Elena took a seat on the edge of the bed, her thoughts racing. "What's your name?" she asked gently. "Alice," the woman replied, her voice barely audible. "Alice Monroe." Elena nodded, trying to make sense of everything. "Alice, can you tell me what happened? Why do the villagers want to sacrifice you?" Alice swallowed hard, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for a way out. They've always been strange. But ever since the curse started, they've become different. They think the only way to end the curse is to offer a life to the spirits, to appease them. They've done it before. I've heard the stories, but this time, they want me. Elena's heart sank. The villagers were so desperate to end the curse that they were willing to sacrifice an innocent life. And Alice, terrified and alone, had become their target. The weight of the decision she had to make pressed down on her even more heavily now. Could she let Alice be sacrificed to break the curse? Or could she take matters into her own hands, knowing the consequences? "I can't let them do that to you," Elena said firmly, though her voice trembled. "We'll find another way." Alice's eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head. "There is no other way. The curse is too strong. It's like a disease, spreading through the village, corrupting everything it touches. If the ritual isn't completed, I don't know what will happen, but it will be worse than death. The spirits, They won't rest. Elena felt a surge of fear, but also a determination she hadn't known she was capable of. She couldn't stand by and let Alice be sacrificed, but she couldn't ignore the curse either. There had to be another way to break it, something the villagers hadn't considered. The ritual? Elena began, trying to piece together what she knew. It requires a life, but what if we could fool the curse? What if we could trick it into accepting something else? Alice looked at her, hope flickering in her eyes. You mean, like a substitute? But how? Elena thought of the key and the book she had found in the mausoleum, the strange symbols and the dark magic that seemed to pulse from the pages. The book had spoken of blood, of sacrifice, but it hadn't specified that the sacrifice had to be human. What if they could offer something else? Something that would satisfy the curse without costing a life? I'm not sure yet, Elena admitted, her mind racing with possibilities. But there has to be a way. We just need to think. Maybe there's something in the book, some way to bend the rules. Alice nodded, though her expression was still uncertain. If there's a way, I'll do anything. I don't want to die, Elena. I can't. Elena stood and moved to the small table, where the book and key lay. She picked up the book and began flipping through the pages, searching for anything that might give them a clue. The symbols seemed to dance on the page, taunting her, but she forced herself to focus, to look for patterns or hints that might help. As she scanned the text, something caught her eye, a passage near the end of the book, written in a different hand than the rest. The writing was jagged and hurried, as if the author had been in a great rush or a state of panic. The words were difficult to make out, but Elena managed to piece together enough to understand. The spirits hunger for life, but they are blind to the source. Blood spilled in their name will satisfy their thirst, but the essence of life can be taken from anything that holds it. Beware, for the sacrifice must be willing, and the offering must be strong in its vitality, or the curse will remain unbroken. Elena read the passage over again, her mind working furiously. The spirits didn't care where the life came from, as long as it was given willingly and had the strength to satisfy their hunger. The book was saying that they could offer something other than a human life, as long as it met those criteria. What if we could offer something else? Elena said, turning to Alice. Something alive, but not human. Something strong. Something with vitality. It might be enough to break the curse without anyone dying. Alice's brow furrowed in confusion. Like what? An animal? Elena nodded slowly. Maybe. The book says the sacrifice has to be willing, so it would have to be something we could control. Something we could convince. Alice's eyes widened as she realized what Elena was suggesting. But how? How would we make an animal willing to sacrifice itself? Elena hesitated, her mind racing. It was a wild idea, almost impossible to imagine, but the alternative was unthinkable. I don't know yet, but there has to be a way. Maybe we can use the ritual, the magic in this book, to influence the animal's mind, to make it think it's willing. Alice stared at her, the fear in her eyes replaced by a glimmer of hope. Do you really think that could work? Elena took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on her. It's a long shot, but it's better than the alternative. We'll need to find the right animal, something strong and healthy, and we'll need to be careful. If we get it wrong, the curse could lash out, and we'll be in even more danger. Alice nodded, determination replacing the fear on her face. I'll help. Whatever it takes, I'll do it. Elena felt a surge of relief. They had a plan, fragile as it was, and for the first time since arriving in Ravensbrook, she felt a glimmer of hope. But the path ahead was still fraught with danger, and there was no guarantee that their plan would work. Tomorrow, Elena said, her voice firm. We'll start tomorrow. We'll find an animal, something strong, and we'll perform the ritual. If we do it right, we can end this curse and save everyone. Alice nodded, though there was still fear in her eyes. Thank you, Elena. I don't know what I would have done if I hadn't found you. Elena managed a small, reassuring smile. We'll get through this together. We have to. But as they settled in for the night, the shadows in the room seemed to deepen, and the whispers in Elena's mind grew louder, more insistent. The spirits were watching, waiting, and the curse that bound this place was far from done with them. The next morning, Elena and Alice set out with renewed determination. The village was still shrouded in an eerie silence, the streets empty as they made their way toward the outskirts, where the forest loomed dark and dense. The sky was overcast, the clouds hanging low, threatening rain. As they walked, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that unseen eyes were tracking their every move. She glanced at Alice, who was pale but resolute, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. We need to find an animal, Elena said, trying to keep her voice steady. Something strong, something that can withstand the ritual. A deer, maybe, or a wild boar. Alice nodded, though her expression was tense. I know where we might find one. There's a clearing in the woods, not far from here, where animals sometimes gather. It's a good place to start. They continued on in silence, the forest closing in around them as they left the village behind. The trees were tall and ancient, their branches intertwining overhead to form a dense canopy that blocked out much of the light. The air was thick with the scent of earth and moss, and the ground was soft underfoot. As they walked, the whispers in Elena's mind grew louder, more urgent, as if the spirits were trying to communicate with her. She could feel their presence all around her, pressing in on her from the shadows. It was as if the forest itself was alive, watching and waiting. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the clearing. It was a small, circular space, surrounded by trees and thick underbrush. The ground was covered in soft grass, and in the center stood a large, ancient oak tree, its gnarled branches reaching out like twisted fingers. Elena and Alice paused at the edge of the clearing, scanning the area for any sign of movement. The air was still, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the breeze. But there was something else, a faint noise, like the distant thrum of a heartbeat, pulsing through the ground beneath their feet. There, Alice whispered, pointing to the far side of the clearing. Elena followed her gaze and saw a large stag, its antlers tall and proud, standing just inside the tree line. The stag was watching them, its dark eyes gleaming with an intelligence that seemed almost unnatural. It didn't move, just stood there, as if waiting. That's it, Elena said, her voice barely more than a breath. That's the one. Alice nodded, her hand trembling slightly as she gripped Elena's arm. How do we do this? Elena took a deep breath, steadying herself. We need to get closer. I'll use the key to open the door to the ritual space, and then I'll try to influence its mind, to make it willing. Stay close and be ready to help if something goes wrong. They approached the stag slowly, carefully, not wanting to startle it. The animal watched them with those dark, knowing eyes, its breath visible in the cool morning air. As they drew nearer, Elena could feel the power of the place, the ancient magic that thrummed through the earth, resonating with the key she carried. When they were close enough, Elena knelt down and pressed the key into the soft earth. The ground seemed to shift beneath her touch, the soil parting as if in response to the key's presence. She twisted the key, feeling a resistance, as if the earth itself was fighting her. But then, with a soft click, the key turned, and the ground beneath them shuddered. A doorway opened, a narrow, shadowy passage leading down into the earth, lined with stone walls that glistened with moisture. The air that wafted up from the passage was cold, tinged with the scent of decay and something else, something ancient and powerful. Elena stood and took a step back, the key still clutched in her hand. The stag remained where it was, watching them, its eyes locked on the passage. The whispers in Elena's mind grew louder, more insistent, urging her to complete the ritual, to end the curse. "This is it," Elena said, her voice shaking. "We have to bring it down into the passage, and then I'll try to influence its mind." Alice nodded, though her face was pale. "I'll help. Just tell me what to do." Elena reached out with her thoughts, trying to connect with the stag, to reach into its mind and bend its will. She could feel the ancient magic all around her, the power of the place coursing through her veins. The stag's eyes widened, its body tensing as it felt her touch, but it didn't move. "Come," Elena whispered, her voice filled with the power of the ritual. "Come to me." The stag hesitated, its muscles trembling, but then it began to move, slowly at first, then more confidently, as if drawn by an invisible force. Elena could feel its mind, the wildness, the fear, but also a deep, primal understanding. The stag knew what was happening, and it was willing to follow. They led the stag to the edge of the passage, the animal's hooves sinking into the soft earth. Elena felt a surge of triumph, but it was quickly tempered by the realization of what they were about to do. This was a living creature, strong and proud, and they were about to take its life to break a curse that had plagued this place for generations. "Are you ready?" Elena asked, her voice shaking. Alice nodded, though tears glistened in her eyes. "I'm ready." Elena took a deep breath and led the stag down into the passage, the shadows closing in around them as they descended into the earth. The air grew colder, thicker, as they went deeper, the walls closing in on either side. The whispers were all around them now, a cacophony of voices, urging them on, demanding the sacrifice. At the bottom of the passage, they reached another chamber, similar to the one Elena had found beneath the mausoleum. The walls were lined with niches, each holding a stone urn, and in the center of the chamber was a raised altar, the stone worn smooth by centuries of use. Elena led the stag to the altar, the animal's breath coming in short, sharp bursts. The power of the place thrummed in the air, a palpable force that pressed down on them, urging them to complete the ritual. "This is it," Elena said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "We have to do it now." Alice stepped forward, her hand trembling as she reached out to the stag. The animal's dark eyes met hers, and for a moment, there was a connection, a silent understanding that passed between them. Then, with a deep breath, Alice drew a small knife from her belt and pressed it to the stag's throat. "I'm sorry," Alice whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry." With a swift motion, she drew the blade across the stag's throat. The animal tensed, its body shuddering as the blood poured from the wound, staining the stone altar. The whispers in the chamber grew louder, more frantic as the blood pooled on the stone, and the air seemed to vibrate with the power of the sacrifice. Elena stepped back, her heart pounding in her chest as she watched the stag's life ebb away. The ancient magic in the chamber pulsed, the symbols on the walls glowing faintly as the blood flowed across the altar. The whispers reached a fever pitch, a deafening chorus that seemed to shake the very walls. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. The chamber fell silent, the air thick with the scent of blood and death. The stag lay still on the altar, its life drained away, and for a moment, there was nothing but the oppressive silence. Elena's heart sank. Had they failed? Had the sacrifice not been enough? The fear clawed at her, threatening to overwhelm her. But before she could succumb, The ground beneath them began to tremble. The walls of the chamber shuddered, the stone cracking as the ancient magic surged through the earth. The blood on the altar began to glow, a bright, eerie light that filled the chamber, illuminating the symbols on the walls. The whispers returned, but this time they were different, softer, more melodic, as if the spirits were singing. Elena and Alice watched in awe as the light spread, filling the chamber with a warm, golden glow. The air hummed with power, and the symbols on the walls seemed to dance in the light. The ground beneath their feet shifted, the earth itself seeming to breathe as the curse that had bound this place for so long began to unravel. "It's working," Elena whispered, tears of relief streaming down her face. "It's really working." Alice nodded, her own tears falling freely. "We did it. We actually did it." The light continued to grow, filling the chamber until it was almost blinding. The walls seemed to dissolve, the stone crumbling away as the ancient magic tore through the earth, breaking the curse that had held the souls trapped for so long. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the light faded, and the chamber fell silent once more. The whispers were gone, the air still and quiet, and the oppressive weight that had hung over the place had lifted. Elena took a deep breath, her heart finally beginning to slow. It was over. The curse was broken, the souls freed. The sacrifice had worked, and they had survived. But as she looked down at the stag, lying lifeless on the altar, she couldn't help but feel a deep sorrow. They had taken a life to end the curse, and though it had been necessary, it still weighed heavily on her heart. "We should go," Alice said softly, her voice tinged with sadness. Elena nodded, wiping the tears from her face. "Yes, let's go home." They made their way back up the passage, the air growing warmer as they ascended. The village awaited them, free from the curse that had plagued it for so long, and though the cost had been great, they had done what needed to be done. As they emerged into the light of day, the sun broke through the clouds, casting the village in a warm, golden glow. The air was fresh and clean, the oppressive atmosphere gone, and for the first time since Elena had arrived, the village felt peaceful. Marjorie was waiting for them at the edge of the clearing, her expression solemn but relieved. She nodded to Elena as they approached, a silent acknowledgement of what they had accomplished. "It is done," Marjorie said softly, her voice filled with a quiet pride. "You have broken the curse. The spirits are free." Elena nodded, her heart heavy, but at peace. "It's over." Marjorie reached out and took Elena's hand, her grip surprisingly strong for her frail appearance. "Thank you, child. You have done what many before you could not. Your grandmother would be proud." Elena felt a lump form in her throat at the mention of her grandmother. She had come here to uncover her family's past, to find out what had drawn her grandmother to this place. In the end, she had found more than she had ever expected, and though it had been difficult, she knew she had done the right thing. "Thank you," Elena said, her voice choked with emotion. "I couldn't have done it without you." Marjorie smiled, a rare, gentle smile that seemed to light up her entire face. "You have a strong spirit, Elena. Your grandmother's spirit. I see that now. You will do well in this life." Elena smiled through her tears, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. She had faced the darkness, and she had won. The village of Ravensbrook was free, and though the cost had been great, the future now seemed brighter, filled with the promise of peace. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the village in a warm, golden light, Elena and Alice stood together, side by side, knowing that they had faced the darkness and emerged victorious. The curse was broken. The souls were free, and so too were they.